Welcome everyone to Linguistics in the Pub online for October 2020. I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm working on Wurundjeri land, and I'd like to acknowledge the land that people are on, wherever you are, and the languages that Indigenous people speak on those lands. And I'd like to welcome all Indigenous participants. So we have an interesting topic for tonight, doing research using archives. It's something that a lot of people have been talking about because I guess linguists who have already been using archival records and those who haven't and have just been doing field work are thinking, well, maybe I need to focus more on archival materials while I can't travel. So we did have a little bit of discussion about using archival records in the very first Linguistics in the Pub online, and Claire Bowen talked a bit about her student projects at Yale, where they developed sketch grammars from archival materials in collaboration with language centres in Western Australia, which is a really great example of using archival records for a purpose that's useful to the community. So the panelists we've got here today all use archival records in different ways and have a lot of interesting insights into using archival records in linguistic research. So I'd just like to ask the panel to introduce themselves. Maybe I'll just name you so you know which order to go in. Stefan, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure, thank you. I'm Stefan Schnell and I work at the University of Bamberg in Germany. And I have been doing fieldwork and language documentation myself in North Vanuatu. So I have archived lots of material of that language. And in recent years, I have been working on research based on that material and also material from many other people in cross-linguistic research, comparing the use of language rather than just grammar, so to say. So maybe I'll say that briefly. Thanks.
Thanks, Stefan. Corey, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Hello, I'm Corey Theatre. I'm here on Ghana Yota, in Ghana country, what they call Adelaide. I'm a Gunda Jamara person with ties across to a few different groups in Victoria, the Gunai and the Mukdadwan as well, amongst others. And I'm doing my studies on the Gunai language from Gippsland. And that's all based on historical archival material.
Thanks a lot. Nick, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Nick Thieberger. I'm at the University of Melbourne. I've done research in Vanuatu and in Australia and created a collection of materials for the language I work on in Vanuatu, including a collection of archival materials that I've taken and reworked, so early manuscripts and that kind of thing. But I also run PARADISEC, which is a digital archive. So I'm very interested in both how things are produced and how things are used in language archives.
Thanks, Nick. Stephen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, yes. So I'm Stephen Morey from La Trobe University. For the last 25 years or so, I've been researching smaller languages spoken on the border of India and Burma, making recordings, videos, audio recordings, archiving them here and there, writing grammatical descriptions and particular interest in traditional songs. But today I want to talk mostly about another area of interest, which is the Indigenous languages of Victoria, and particularly delving into the manuscript archives, such as we find in libraries and museums here in Australia and other places, and finding linguistic information from those. So that's mainly what I'll be talking about today, because I know that Stefan and Nick will be covering the other side of things, and Corey will be talking, I think, about some of those sorts of issues to do with manuscripts as well.
Thanks, Stephen. I probably should introduce myself. My name's Ruth Singer. I'm based at the University of Melbourne too, and I work with Morey community in West Arnhem, doing field work, and also there is quite a lot of archival records on the language too, which I've also used, and some of them I've gone through with speakers to transcribe them and translate them, that kind of thing, and also produce resources from them. So the first question I thought we could all make a comment about is what kind of linguistic research can you do with archives? Because for people who haven't been doing much archival research, they might already be going along with their own types of research that they're already doing. And then they might be thinking, well, can I keep doing this type of research the next year or two, or do I need to, switch? To what extent can you keep doing the kind of research you're doing, or do you need to adapt to what's possible with archival records? So maybe we'll just stick with that same order of speaking, if that's all right, which was Stefan, Corey, Nick, Stephen, and then you guys will just know when you're coming up. So Stefan, if you want to just start by commenting on that.
Yeah, so I think I should probably start by saying that, of course, archival material in the first instance can be used to produce descriptive accounts of languages, I would say. And I think it's also good to mention that, all that sort of free speech, free narrative data is still quite important for descriptive grammar. So so that we don't just go with our sort of checklist of the kinds of structures that we want to sort of find in a certain language or we expect to find, but that we're also open to, finding structures that we're not expecting maybe, and include that in descriptions. I think that's one important role of language documentation material. And then also, we can tap into sort of classic kind of corpus linguistic questions, or for instance, differences in register, genre, style, these kinds of things, if we have that kind of material from our language documentation projects, which I think would be really interesting. So think of work by Doug Biber, for instance, classic corpus linguistic work, which he has done on English, but also on Somali, for instance, and there's lots of other potential, I would say. And then, of course, I do believe that we can do lots of cross-linguistic research based on language documentation material, as we've been doing. So looking at what kinds of structures, what kinds of patterns are particularly frequent in the use of different languages, and what do these preferences of use tell us about processing, constraints, cognitive biases, but also ways of how languages change. So I think there are sort of very, sort of big questions that can be addressed using that kind of material. I think the big question here is, so in order to be able to do that kind of research, do we need more controlled data or not? And I think there is lots of ways. I mean, I'm not going to go into much detail right now, maybe, but there are lots of ways of, and I think it's also important here to also use that kind of, free range language documentation data in order to do that. That's what we've been doing. I think one prerequisite for this is, maybe I should mention that, is that what you're interested in, if you want to do that kind of research, should be phenomena that are generally ubiquitous, kind of, so that you can expect them to find in any kind of record. Otherwise, it can be a little bit difficult to find enough instances of whatever phenomenon you're interested in. And I think, it's not a coincidence that a lot of research based on more free narratives focuses on, for instance, phonetic phonological variation, or on, say, for instance, subject realization, which, comes up all the time, so to say, in all utterances, in all sentences. And that's basically also what we are doing. So we are interested in reference in discourse and event expression, and it's possible to do that partly also because that comes up all the time. But that's what we do when we produce discourse, and that's what will be attested in any language documentation record. So I think, so this is more like the, sort of focusing right into this a bit narrower kind of topic of what linguistic, particular linguistic research. I think that's what I would say to that for now.
Thanks, Stefan. And I don't know if we'll have time to touch on corpora as well, but Stefan's been working on corpora of a range of languages that are publicly available that people can use for research, but maybe that'll have to be another topic. We'll see how we go. Corey, if you want to comment on that question, and maybe also talk about, if your motivations probably aren't strictly linguistic, the goals of linguistic research, but also the other motivations for doing archival research.
Yeah, I think one of the main differences between Stefan and probably even Stephen is that the archive that they're referring to is kind of been collated and created by them in their previous work. And it's probably in linguistic terms a lot richer, or has a lot more data there, and allows for the kind of investigation of these more, I don't know, like discourse analysis and this type of stuff. Whereas the work that I'm looking at is really, well, one thing, I didn't make the records. This archive is over 100 years old. These are really old documents. They're all manuscript material, really. And I guess the kind of work that I'm doing is more akin to the projects that you mentioned with Claire Bowen and the WA mob over there. It's really just getting a sketch grammar, a word list, a dictionary. It's really that initial kind of stage in language revival. And because of the state that the language is in, my research hasn't really been affected by the whole COVID, because I've been working with this archive anyway. I mean, the ability to access the archives that haven't been digitized is going to be affected, but a lot of that work's been done by Stephen. And I was in Melbourne checking out the last of the Hagenauer collection in March, just before everything got shut down. So I haven't had to change, really. I've been fortunate in that way. So, all right.
Hello. No, that's good. Yeah, I think there is also a lot of interesting work done with fairly small archival deposits. We had a talk at ANU, the Australian National University had an online seminar last week by Hannah Haney, and she had these small word lists of North American languages. But she did this interesting dialect study and looking at, you know, whether dialects were more different if there was mountains between them and that kind of thing. So, yeah, I think people do things with, you know, different sized archives, as Nick probably will be able to talk about. He also works with small records.
Wow.
Okay. Maybe I'll share my screen. What I want to talk about really is the possibilities that there are in collections, so like PARADISEC, for example. So here's an example. This is a collection made by a missionary in the 1950s and eventually found its way to us because there was nowhere else that they could archive their materials. It's a lot of recordings and notes, and we've put the notes online. You can go and look at the notes and you can see that they're pretty good. I mean, they're a bit daunting, but you can see that there's some really interesting material in there. And no one's done anything with this. So this would be a really fine project for somebody. There's the recordings, you'd be able to link up recordings with these notes. And this is Azmat from Indonesia. And, you know, there's a project and it's just sitting there. This is all this material there, hours of recordings. Another example is Alan Walker's materials. Alan Walker was a linguist who worked in Northern Australia, but he also worked in Timor. And his collection of Timor materials is enormous. You can see this is image 6 of 3,152 images of notes. We can look through the notes. And there are recordings for this as well. So, you know, a project here could be, I mean, any number of projects could work on a detailed grammar of this language. He wrote a sketch grammar. But because we have the recordings, you can also do all kinds of really interesting studies of prosody, you know, and other things like that. So, you know, you can have a look at that. It's all online. And the family, unfortunately, he died quite young. So his family has made it all available, but you can see there's a lot of detail that isn't in this collection. So one of the other uses is that somebody could write a finding aid for this material. So Anthony Vaughan at Melbourne Uni did a sub-thesis for his master's, which was looking at this collection and writing a finding aid for that collection, which is very useful for other people who want to find out more about it. And you can see it's published in a journal. Just quickly, that's more of the Alan Walker collection, and you can see you can go down to the level of audio materials. Another collection, we have two really interesting collections of Nguni's material, Nguna from Central Vanuatu, and these are grammar and text. So I've scanned the book of grammar and text, but there are also audio recordings. So this is just ready for somebody to link up the texts with the audio recordings. The grammar that's written is very thin. It's a very small sketch grammar. And again, all the kinds of prosodic information you could get from the audio that isn't there in the original grammar. And what's then, again, this is another collection of Nguni's, and the book is Nguna Voices. And this material is also in their collection, and there are recordings, and you can see that the texts are given in this form. You could link them up with recordings. So all of this is sitting in PARADISEC. It's ready for somebody to grab and do something really interesting with. And there are many, many other collections like that in PARADISEC. So maybe that's enough for the moment.
Thanks, Nick. Stephen, do you want to just address that topic?
Yeah, I do. So I'm also going to share my screen, but I'm going to start in a slightly different place. So here you can perhaps see a scan that the State Library of New South Wales has put up of some material collected by the Reverend, well, I don't know if he actually was an ordained Reverend. I would always call him the Reverend William Thomas, and this would have been written down in the 1840s or 1850s. And what you can see is that in the middle of it, there is a bit of a word list, or at least a kind of a small glossary explaining the meanings of certain terms. And so one of the things that I'm interested in doing is firstly transcribing things like this. And this was my honours project back in 1999, transcribing these manuscripts, and then taking materials like this and trying to find out what we can about the language that's being referred to. So this is the Woiwurrung, the language of the Wurundjeri people on whose land many of us are sitting, and from where Ruth is kind of leading this discussion. And as you can immediately see from this, there is so there are issues with what these particular spellings might represent. There are issues with what kind of grammatical structures might be underlying this. I'm not proposing to talk about what kind of analysis we can make of these things for the moment, but just to say that there are large amounts of these materials from the 19th century, not just in Australia, but indeed all around the world, that are also asking to be examined. So that's a different kind of archive from the one that Nick was talking about. We'd love to have the kind of knowledge that went into that archive, but this is what we have. So perhaps I'll stop that there and we can come back to some more of these discussions further on.
Thanks, Stephen. So the second question, I guess you could address in two different ways. What are the practical aspects of, I guess, accessing archival materials, which Nick's already talked about? Obviously, one of the easiest ways is to use PARADISEC materials because they're very easy to find and access, the ones that are on open access. But also, I thought in this second round of comments to talk about ethical issues and how to connect with communities whose language it is, which is going to be a challenge for people to work on archival materials at the moment when they can't travel. And so how would you build those relationships, perhaps? And at the moment. So yeah, feel free to address one or both of those questions, which is more just about the nitty-gritty, I guess. If you want to start off, Stefan, we'll just do the same order again if you don't mind.
So just trying to think how to address this question. So I mean, as I said, I'm not working myself particularly in Australia. I mean, similar considerations would of course also apply to Vanuatu when it comes to the use of material from archives. Maybe generally I can say that, I mean, in particular, when we're doing this cross-linguistic work, that may come, you know, at the face of it with this sort of impression, you know, there are now coming these people just harvesting whatever is there and then, you know, doing their kind of fancy academic linguistic stuff. And that's not what we're doing, kind of, in the sense that we would always be working with so closely together with those people who are working on these respective languages and to know what can be shared freely, because we would like to, you know, the interest of open science, material should be openly accessible, of course. So we would, you know, be closely collaborating with people who know the communities and you know, make or pay a lot of attention to what can, you know, where we have permissions to share what or not. So I don't, so I mean, obviously that should be the primary concern. We have also been, may, you know, also include some languages from Australia, as you said in the beginning. So from for instance, Hmong, maybe, and then there's also some other languages that's still all in the making. Yeah, I think it's, I mean, obviously no one will, or people will know what they're allowed to share and what they can share, and we'll include that. It can sometimes be, you know, so for our kind of research, we would like to have certain kinds of fairly free narratives and so on, and that can sometimes be a bit of an issue when it comes to narrative texts, because they may be a little more sensitive in different communities. But yeah, that's so we sometimes may have to compromise sort of, so we would like to have sort of free narratives, but sometimes we may have to include other kinds of text if we don't get, or if, you know, other text can't be shared. But I think generally speaking, and I guess many people would agree with that, it's a good idea to, when we're using archival material, to also always get in touch where possible with people who have been curating these collections, and you know, and work together with people to, well, and also of course to acknowledge their and to, you know, to include these collectors and also acknowledge their work and include them in projects wherever possible.
Stefan, did you want to show people the multicast site, or?
Oh, I can do that. Yep, since everyone's been.
I've sent around a link.
Yeah, so I can do that. Oh, this is not it, but this is it. So so this is the multicast collection. The multicast stands for Multilingual Corpus of Annotated Spoken Text. Been working on this together with Jeffrey Haig and Neil Schibor, both also from Bamberg. And then, you know, there's at the moment 13 so corpora from 13 languages, well, around the world, but you can see there's, you know, quite a heavy bias towards those areas that mainly Jeff and I have expertise in. So Jeff works on languages of the Middle East and Iranian languages primarily, and I've been working on languages from the Pacific, as I said, and also have supervised PhD students working on languages from this area here. So that's why we have these two sort of focus points at the moment, but there's more languages coming in, as I said. And I should briefly say that the core of this collection is this kind of annotation here. Won't talk about it in much detail here, of course, but the point here is that these annotations of text are done in the same way across all these languages, which will then enable exact comparison of languages in certain regards. And then, so we've included here these, so for each language, we have a little bit here with a small text describing where the material comes from, who's collected it originally, and then you have these different files here. You can access the files in different formats. You can also access the entire collection actually through a multicast R package when you want to go straight to statistical analysis. And then you also have options here for some preview. So I can, hang on. So this is maybe interesting. So you can click on a text here, and then you'll see here the transcription and also the whatever annotation you would like to see, and then you can play these little sections here. It sometimes takes a little while to buffer, but hopefully will come up. Maybe I have to.
It might be might be in the sharing settings.
Could be, or it's the what they call Vorführ effect in German. So when you demonstrate it, it never worked. Anyway, so anyway, so but it does it should work. So you can try, and yeah, and then so that's the website. Here's work that was based on what we've done here, and then there's also guidelines if people want to contribute with their collections. And then I shouldn't forget to mention that this work has also been funded very generously, and different institutions have been involved. So I shouldn't forget this. And here's just the note that all of this is openly accessible and can be used for academic research. So that's yeah, that's what that collection looks like. Yeah, at the moment there is about 4 corpora, new corpora that are about to be included in this and kind of finished, and then there's I think a total of another 5 or so in the where people have just started or are getting started to do this kind of work, this annotation work. So that's,
Thanks, Stefan.
yeah.
Corey, anything you'd like to say would be great, but I guess if people did want to start working on archival records of an Indigenous language where they hadn't had any connection to the community before, I don't know if you have any advice for what would be a good way to start doing that. Where would be the first place to start?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I mean, and it's made trickier by the current situation that we're in. Because within the archive, you've got material that's collected. Often when this stuff was collected in the publications, they didn't talk about the informants, what they call the informants, and who actually gave this language material. But when you're going through the archive, you can see that material, and you can see who was the speaker, who uttered those words, and who. So, and then that person, what I'm trying to get to is, I'm just going to make the situation more complicated by pointing out that you might have a speaker like, okay, we'll go with my ancestor, John Conley, who worked with Howard and collected a lot of language resources for the Mukjadwan people, which is a Western Kulin dialect of the Grampians. Now, when you're coming into this material, often what's happened is there's been like, not synthesis, but like a kind of collective formation of Aboriginal people. So the Gunditjmara people as they exist now are not how they used to exist. We've come together and we've formed these collectives and these corporations, and we're moving forward in this world. But when you go back and you look at these archival records, sometimes they're at this more nuanced level, this dialectal level, or this more localized level in which people were living prior to this change. So you might, like for John Conley, it's like, who do you contact? Is it sufficient to contact the corporation, which kind of is an overarching thing for the Gunditjmara, or do you need to go to the actual descendants of those people? So that's I mean, that's just making it trickier for you. But that's kind of what I'm finding in my work, because on the one hand, I'm working on a Gunai and I'm a Gunai person, and there's resources from my other ancestors in there. But to what extent, and I engage with my family and stuff, and it's all very convenient for me, but to what extent do I have to engage with other family groups and other people whose ancestors has contributed to this historical record, you know? So I guess that's just really repositioning the question for a lot of Indigenous linguists and the kind of situation that we face. So I don't know. I mean, to start off, you go to the corporation, I guess, or you try and, I guess you really question your motivation of why you're doing that research. If you've got no connection to that community, you know, that's what I'd be thinking. Why are you doing that? You know, if it's not, you're living on the country maybe, or what's your connection? What's your motivation to work with a certain mob?
Well, I guess sometimes linguists are deluded, but often they think they've got something to offer, I guess.
I mean, yeah, that's true. But yeah, and I mean, if that's the motivation, then you might be looking at where can I do the best work, you know? I find a lot of the time that linguists want to go off to these exotic places and work with these mobs that never been exposed to the digital technologies of this world and whatnot. But you can do a lot just on the country that you're on, you know, working with the people, because there's Aboriginal people everywhere. You know? And you can talk to, you can find people in your own backyard. That's, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's good advice for people working on Indigenous Australia, who want to work with Indigenous Australian materials, is to get in touch with the local corporation, or I guess some parts of Australia there's language centres or council or whatever.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, language centres, corporations, land councils, all these type of places to start. But you'll find that the community is not homogenous. I mean, you people know this. I don't need. There's different people, different groups are going to say different, within the one group, different sections of the community are going to have different opinions, and you just got to make sure that you are doing it for the right reasons, you know? What's your motivation? And if it is to help, then, and you are doing that, then I don't see why people wouldn't be happy.
Yeah. Thanks, Corey. I might pass it over to Nick.
Thanks. Okay. So I'll share this again. One of the things that occurred to me, I worked on native title claims in Western Australia, and a lot of that was, you know, archival research that was being used in the legal process to show people's connection to country. Whatever you may think of native title, and, you know, it's not the greatest process, but what disturbed me partly, I mean, one of the many things that disturbed me about it was that all the research that was being done was just being lost after the court process. And, you know, they were spending lots of money on archival research, and there was no authority that said, well, let's gather all that material and make it useful. So I thought one of the pieces of research in Western Australia, a sort of piece of research that's used all the time, is the Daisy Bates material, which is held in the National Library, but also in the Batty Library and Bar Smith Library and other places. But it's all held on paper. And I wanted to try and get this material out into a form that could be more useful for Aboriginal people who look through these materials. You know, Corey talked about the fact that there's a lot of synthesis and things put together, but Daisy Bates, when she collected vocabularies, these vocabularies were usually collected from a single person who's named. So each of these on the map that you can see here is a vocabulary. And if we we can go and look at each of these vocabularies. And in the top here, we've got the name of the person who gave this vocabulary to the collector. And you can see the language name there. And you can see the original handwritten questionnaire here. And then there's a typed version that Daisy Bates made. And that's the version that I then had typed and aligned, so that as you scroll through this, you can search this now. So what was originally a huge collection of paper, and there are 26,000 pages of paper in this collection, you know, which you could, if you wanted that word in particular, so that, you know, how were you going to find that? You'd have to look through all those papers to find that word, but now you can search through it. So I think there's something here that we, you know, as linguists can offer, is the expertise that we have in the kind of technologies that we're looking at here to present materials and make them available so that they can be reused. You know, so people could now download this. People have downloaded it. They're using it in schools. You know, there are all kinds of uses that you can put this to. But, you know, you can also do the cute things like this, where you put them on a map and here's the word for I in all of those different languages. And each of those, of course, is linked. So if we click on that, then it takes us to that vocabulary and shows us that word for I. So all this sort of linking and everything is possible because of the way that the material is sort of extracted from the archive and made useful for other purposes. So I suppose my interest is that we don't just use material ourselves and then, you know, throw it away again, but we think of ways of using the material in our research so that it can enrich the research record so that other people can keep using it in the future. So this is one of those kinds of examples, I suppose.
Thanks, Nick. That's another resource. I've been sending things around in the chat that people have mentioned, so I'll send that around too. All right, Stephen.
Yes.
Have a say.
So look, I do, and I wanted to start off by taking you back to following up on a point that Corey made. So when I was 14, I came up with the idea that it would be appropriate to learn something about the language of the people who had traditionally lived here. This is in Melbourne. This obviously wasn't a common thought at the time, so I used to go to the State Library of Victoria and hand copy documents such as this, which for those of you who recognise this is actually the second edition of Louise Hercus's book about the languages of Victoria, and it would have been the first edition that I was looking at in 1974 and 75. And I remember hand copying it, and I remember hand copying something like this tentative phonemic system and simply not able to understand what was the difference between D with an underline, D with a dot, and DJ, and why there was an N with an underline, and sorry, an N with a dot and an R with a dot, and so on. So fast forward to nearly 50 years to today, and one of the things that I have been getting more and more involved with is meeting with community members. It's all been by Zoom lately, but it is going on, to talk about these archival materials that have been in libraries. So this is a published book, but you also have lots of manuscripts such as before, and how we can work as academics together with community members to help bring these materials back to communities and make them more accessible, more useful, more interesting. And this kind of thing is going on, and not just with the communities here in Victoria that I'm in contact with, but also with the people that I'm in contact with by Facebook on a regular basis, including in the last half an hour. Some have been messaging me from India and Burma who are wanting to get access to more of the archival material about the languages that they speak, that is held in libraries and sometimes in private collections all around the world. So the practical aspects, okay, so there's access. So nowadays we have PDF files of pretty much all these 19th century and well into the 20th century books. You don't have to copy them by hand. Back in 1974, the only way that I could get the information from this page back home to my house was to hand copy it. It was even before photocopying. So we've gone through a long period of change over the last 50 years, and we can now access materials much more easily. So the practical aspect of it is that all these different online archives that we've been talking about today are all making these materials more available. But the ethical side of it is, as Corey mentioned and others have mentioned, it is of less interest and value to be researching these languages if there isn't contact with the community members who are the speakers of these varieties. And that actually makes the work much more interesting. So I think maybe I'll leave that there because it's getting very close to the end of our hour, I think.
It's getting quite close, but we do actually have time to answer some questions. If anybody wants to send them on the chat.
Could I just say one short thing? Sure. So I just wanted to say for, you know, that kind of research that I've been talking about seems kind of very abstract and very remote from the communities in some sense. And I think what's important to note here is that for one thing, and one good reason to use sort of language documentation material is also that you don't need to record things that are not necessarily interesting to the community. So if you think of, I mean, communities may be different, of course, but, you know, a pair film retelling may not be particularly valuable to a particular community, although, you know, some researchers would say that's what you need for that kind of cross-linguistic research. So I think, you know, that's one thing where I think, you know, that's another good reason to use that kind of material that is actually also of use and interest to the community. And another point that I would like to mention, and that has already often been mentioned, is it's, you know, in that world of, you know, funding bodies where we, you know, try to seek funding for language documentation projects, they are increasingly demanding that you also say what's the academic value of it, what big research questions can you address with that kind of stuff, and that's been a kind of you know, process over recent years. And of course we would all love to have just, you know, just funding for language documentation, but in reality it has become more and more useful to also include all those connections. And I think in this sense, you know, it may I think one of the hopes of that kind of work is also that it will also feed back into, you know, giving good motivation from a sort of academic point of view and make it sort of convincing to funders, among other things, to support, you know, sort of community-oriented work that it will also be. So I think there's, you know, that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think to have this sort of interconnection of these different aspects there and those synergies. Yeah.
Thanks, Stefan. Yeah, I think when you are working with archives, you do, it's also a positive of it as well as a challenge that you're bringing a lot of things together, as well as connecting with the community and connecting with linguistic research and, you know, language, the area of language documentation. I don't think we have any questions from the audience. If you do have one, please type it in now. Otherwise, we'll move on to the small group discussion. No, I think I was too negative about our chances of being able to answer questions before. All right, well, I'll stop the live stream. Thanks for those of you who joined us on YouTube.